Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about Ssangsu Geombup Ibon, so Form 2, Part 1. As mentioned in the previous video, I'm deliberately wearing this uniform because I'm giving a lot of information that's not canonical to the Federation. Know that the form that we're actually going to be doing, so the actual movements and all of that, will be canonical, but the explanations and the details will not be. But with that, let's just get started. The beginning is going to look very, very similar to what we've already seen. You're going to notice that we're going to start to incorporate ideas that we learned from Form 1 into this new form, as well as some very interesting, so a lot of theories I have on this form and for Gumdo in general kind of make themselves manifest here, and they're very interesting to me, so let's get started. Yeah. Yeah. A quick note on the one that was going this way, the footwork is ever so slightly changed because I didn't want to go off the mat. So you can notice I kind of like stepped back a little bit in order to throw that other cut. Just know normally, so the one that was going this way is still pretty good. So it starts off very similar to Form 1, right? So our feet are together in our chumbi position, same crosscut, same purpose as with Form 1, getting some distance as opposed to necessarily cutting someone in half in front of us, right? So we're here, we draw, big old epic grab overhead, draw back, and then again, taking those 3 seconds, 3 breaths, whatever that might be, to really hone your ability right here. But this next movement, again, we only did a few movements, but there's a lot of interesting stuff they can use to incorporate here, right? So one introduction. So this is not the way that's canonical with the Federation, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. But this introduces our classic X and 11 blocks, right? So with our first movement, X block, the criteria for a good X block, normally, right? So there are other variants of the X and 11 block, is obviously sword is above the head, noting that none of my head, if I'm looking ahead of you, is below, no, none of my head is above the blade. Granted, there are similar movements, so for example, we have a block that can use this, for example, which does have the head above, but for our typical X and 11 blocks, we'll make sure our sword is protecting the head, right? That's its main purpose. So, ideally, we still have the blade portion still above our head, or the actual head here, and we have the bladed version, or the weak of the sword, so the end of the sword still protecting, again, if I kind of look at myself in profile, still protecting the shoulders as well. So it's a fully protective shield. Notice that it's also going more forward. It's not fully forward, because that'll be more of a defense, but it's enough, right? So unlike, for example, Fiore, historical European swordmaster who was talking about having his sword tip above the guard, notice the different weapons you're using, right? So we want the tip below the guard so that something can be deflected off of it, as opposed to if you had a crossguard, for example, you want to catch the sword with the crossguard if we're using a longsword. However, we're using a katana-like weapon, again, a curved, single-edged weapon. We're going to make sure that we have a nice shield here that will allegedly, and I'll get into details in a little bit, allegedly, if it does receive a shot, is going to deflect offward harmlessly. But before we proceed, let's talk about it's not quite an elephant in the room because most people don't realize there's an elephant in the room, right? But when two sharp objects, right, so two blades, make contact, and for now, and I'm going to dial this back in a little bit, if we assume they are blade versus blade, which would be the strongest geometrically for us, right? Now granted, so for example, in Japanese martial arts, it's encouraged for you to tilt the blade slightly one way or the other, so it's not fully blade versus blade when you block, because that would really damage your sword pretty quickly, right? So any of us who have done bamboo cutting, and there's like either like a stone embedded in the bamboo or you accidentally hit the stand, it just takes one bad piece for you to really chip up your sword very, very quickly, right? However, when two bladed weapons interact, so something I do not recommend that you do, but it's a nice thought experiment, is if you imagine, for example, two steak knives kind of banged together, they're gonna stick a little bit, right? So the thought process of having that perfect curve down so that the sword can just gently slide off is ultimately false, right? Because if someone was going full on here, even if I did have a slight angle one way or the other with that deflection, it's going to hit that blade and it's probably going to stick at least enough that's not going to gently kind of like just slide off the sword. Different no sliding involved, right? So a little bit of a myth, right? That's like, oh, as I move this way, for example, it's going to harmlessly move away and I can counter beautifully with an elegant cut using all of their momentum against them. Unlikely, right? That said, you can still use that as a block, right? So for example, if someone does come in and you are able to block it and you are able to essentially catch their sword, blade versus blade, you've effectively killed their momentum. So you can actually use their momentum. You still need to dislodge your sword, right? But notice what the next move is in our form. From here, if we absorb that shock, right, I can actually draw it back. If it's really in bed, I can actually pull him back. Unlikely, but you could. Back for a counter, right? Even using the fact that they're sticky in an adjectival sense, right? Because if they're sticky, I can potentially guide them in a way that they weren't anticipating originally. That brings one interpretation of these movements into play. The idea of a block counter, right? Notice this is not the way the Federation is going to do it. Again, it's a valid approach, so both of these are valid approaches. We're just going to talk about the nuances of each, right? So if it is a block counter, block, use that momentum to counter. Same thing back here. Block, use that to counter. From here, I'm going to describe this specific use of the sweeping block in a little bit. From here, I can block and counter. So notice I did something a little bit different. So let's first back out a little bit. There's nothing going to be too strange here. Again, we call it an X block because it makes an X with our hands. We call it an 11 block because it's an 11 with our hands. So X block is over here. 11 block is over here. Same criteria. Again, tip covering all of the body. Strong of the sword above my head. Ideally, my hands are out of position so they're no longer a target and they're also not going to be hit in the process of defending my face, right? So let's talk about what I just did with this guy over here. So this is what I call a sweeping block. The idea of that, so if a perfect block, that was a little bit of a grand, sorry, that was a really grand adjective there, right? But in a sort of an ideal 11 next block, right? Noticing, I'm going to try to kind of hone it in or turn, kind of see that there is a blade alignment here. So we're using the sharp of the sword essentially to block. With a sweeping block, we're going to be using the back of the sword here. The reason why this is super nice, so if you look at historical or at least antique swords, specifically I'm thinking about like Dao and stuff like that, which are a lot more common kind of see. You see a lot of damage to the back of the sword because that's what's used to deflect, right? So as a sword's coming in, the idea is I'm using the back of the sword, even using the curvature of the sword. Again, because of the curvature, the tip will actually hit it a little bit sooner. And the act of pushing through is going to use that curve to throw it back over my shoulder into another strike. Noticing if I'm using the back of the sword, the act of sticking no longer is really valid, right? Because this is a very smooth portion, there's no edge, so I can deflect quite nicely using the back of the sword. Now notice, can you do this with the X block? Yes, right? So theoretically I can come in here, again catching the sword from behind and countering with the before 11 or diagonal, catching and cutting. So once again, this is not canonical. You will see this better demonstrated in the next form, so Ssangsu Geombup Samban, right? However, this is another way that you can use your X and 11 blocks. So let's talk about another use of this, right? So we had the block counter. The next version isn't specifically canonical, but it's not anti-canonical, which I think that'll make sense in a little bit. The idea of having a passive shield. So from here, from our original use, I'm having this up as a passive guard, right? So I'm holding it up for it to receive the block, and then I counter, or to receive the strike. Versus, if I see someone coming in, I can deflect all in one fluid motion into a counter. Deflect, counter. Deflect, counter. Right? So, that is a little bit more canonical. What they're going to do is essentially, these are just cuts. There's really no block, but they also don't want you to do this thing where you're kind of covering with your hand. They do want you to still cover with the sword as you're going through your cuts. However, it's not necessarily a block. It is mostly to what we call a rolling diagonal. The idea behind that is instead of just being like roll, roll, roll. And we'll talk about why that might be imminently, right? But the idea of this passive shield, again, it just like with the sweeping block, it requires timing. If someone's coming in with that strike, I have to time it to absorb. And ideally, my footwork is not directly into them, right? However, I can use the footwork, kind of move around the target if I need to, using that passive shield for, in order to not get hit, right? So it's kind of always active if I'm always moving the sword. So the next part is where I really, it's interesting because it's not canonical, but it reinforces what the Federation is teaching, right? So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy there. So there's an explanation that I have of why we both want a rolling cut as opposed to just cocking over your shoulder and throwing it back, as well as the weird cutting angle, right? So if you studied, for example, Kali or Iaido or even Kendo to a certain degree, you're going to notice, or Hema, for the same thing, actually Hema. Most cuts to a single person is here if it's an overhead strike. Obviously, there's a lot of other strikes you can do, but if I'm coming down on opponents, I go around here, right? So, for example, the Kisagiri cut is here, right? It's roughly 30 degrees from north, right? But the Federation cut is a full 45. So I'll give a silly reason, maybe not incorrect, but a silly reason why they might do 45. However, I also want to give you a reason that I personally like that also makes a lot of sense to me. So the silly reason is having cut 45 makes it easier to grade bamboo cutting, right? So, for example, when you go to tournaments like in the Olympia in Korea, they're going to have plastic bamboo that are scored on these 45-degree angles. You can cut it. It's going to see how well you did, how close that perfect 45 that you have. It's also a pretty angle as opposed to a very sharp angle like this one, for example. However, if that were truly the only reason, you can also have the bamboo scored at 30 degrees. It doesn't have to be 45. However, there's another reasoning behind this. Again, something that I've talked about many, many times in the past, but because it's introduced in Form 2, let's talk about it now. I could use my favorite bow, right? I've actually had this bow for, I think, 15 years. I really love it. It's really heavy. It's also octagonal. It's a lot of fun. But anyway, so when you look at the Muido Butonji, right, which is our only, as far as we know, at least as far as I know, the only historical sword manual or martial arts manual. Martial arts is a little bit too general. At least for me, the only sword manual from ancient Korea that still exists. So when you look at the Ssangsu, right? Ssangsu is means two-handed, right? However, if you look at a Ssangsu gum, it is this is just from memory, like a 6-foot long sword with a 1/2 foot long handle. I believe can also have like a copper collar past the whatever the Korean name for tuba is, right? So it was past the guard, right? So even this is a little bit on the short side. However, when you think about cutting, right? So first of all, let's talk about the X and 11 blocks, or a rolling cut instead of merely cocking it back, right? This is also a reason why I don't believe Form 1 was developed in the same mindset as all the other forms. However, so this is wood and still relatively heavy, right? So the idea, especially if you're holding it, like if it is supposed to be like a half-foot hilt, right? The act of just being like ba. Can you do it? Absolutely. I'm also trying not to hit the ceiling, which is not something that people on Battlefield have to worry about. However, if I'm here and I have a nice heavy sword, rolling it back is going to help me get a lot more momentum with our strikes, right? So it's going to make it easier for us to move by doing a rolling cut as opposed to necessarily stopping in between as well. Even if I stop and then move, stop and then move, it's very annoying to engage with as opposed to like a passive shield up, passive shield up. Again, noticing how much of a shield you would have, right? By having it up here, notice with the extra length is a really big shield that I can really use to defend myself. So having it as a passive shield as well as gaining momentum is going to be really, really useful for our use with the Ssangsu Gum. And then last thing with our Ssangsu Gum is with our cutting angle. If I did actually cut on that 30-degree angle without hitting the ceiling, it's going to immediately embed itself in the floor as soon as I throw that cut, right? Versus on a 45-degree angle, I can still throw a pretty hearty and powerful cut without having to worry about embedding the sword into the ground, as well as having a nice clean angle with which to cut. But that's probably enough information for part 1. So we're going to continue this with part 2, again, keeping these concepts in mind. But again, as with everything, keep all this with a grain of salt, play with the ideas yourself, and goodness forbid, have some fun with it. Like really think about all these aspects and reincorporate it into your form. But with that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training.